Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hello and welcome back to the Good Reading Podcast. I'm Max Lewis, and today we're joined by journalist and author Paddy Manning, talking about his new book, Body Count: How Climate Change is Killing Us, which goes over some of Australia's worst climate disasters to put a human face on the lives impacted and send a grim message to the rest of the world. The time to act is right now. Paddy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Max.
So you've been a professional journalist for the past 15 years, covering a wide range of topics, and you've also written 2 political memoirs and 2 books on the mining industry. What drew you to write a book about the climate crisis that we're facing in Australia?
Yeah, actually it's been longer than that. I've been 20-something years by now, and
okay.
I've had a long interest in climate change. I used to write a column when I was on the business desk at the Sydney Morning Herald called GBiz, for green business. And right at the very beginning of my career, launched a magazine called Ethical Investor. And all the way through, I've been interested in climate change and how the risks it poses and how people deal with it. And basically, there's a climate thread that runs through all of the 4 previous books I've written. So if I'm writing about the coal seam gas industry and fracking, there's a climate angle there. If I write about a coal miner, Nathan Tinkler, there's a climate angle there. If I write about Malcolm Turnbull, who staked his leadership on willingness to act on climate change, there's a climate angle there. And also if I write about the history of the Greens, there's a climate angle. So all the way through, there's a kind of thread that I've been pulling on, which is why is Australia finding it so hard to deal with climate change.
And how different was the process of writing Body Count as opposed to your previous books?
It was very different because I've decided, my approach was this time to try and cut through. I think a lot of people in the climate debate are bored of the facts and the statistics, the degrees Celsius rise or the parts per million of CO2 or the percentage reductions in emissions that we need to see. All of these things I think have kind of turned into a blur and have become part of a kind of confusion in the public mind about climate change and what needs to happen and what the real risks are. And I decided in this case that I would try and tell the story of climate change by interviewing the people who in a way have suffered the most from it because they've lost family or loved ones to extreme weather events, diseases, other causes that are linked directly or indirectly to global warming. And that is a sort of random sample, if you like, of ordinary Australians who, whether they're at the Black Saturday bushfires or the Queensland floods of 2011 or, suffering a heat wave in Sydney or thunderstorm Astra outbreak in Melbourne, these are, or over the Black Summer, in fact, including from, smoke from the bushfires that we saw. And I've interviewed a family who lost their mother and wife in Canberra when Canberra had the worst air quality in the world. And so all of these linked one way or another to global warming. And I've tried to tell the story through their eyes by talking to them. And they've got, all their own views and doubts and beliefs about climate change. And I've tried to just tell those exactly as they were told to me. But I think by pulling all those stories together, it does provide a picture of exactly what the subtitle says, how climate change is killing us. And I think that's not recognised in the general debate about climate that we have, which kind of talks about it as though it's about electricity prices. And, it's a global problem that's a long way off. I think that's no longer the reality.
And what was that like for you, hearing so many harrowing experiences from such a wide range of people?
In some ways it was surprising the impact that it did have on me because I kind of bowled into it, not knowing whether people would talk to me or not, or whether they would, be uniformly sceptical or about the connection between the death of, their loved one and global warming, or how they would view it. So I suppose my kind of focus initially was on, will I be able to talk to anyone at all? And so whether I was rocking up to, a small town in the middle of Tasmania, or going to Townsville in the wake of the Townsville floods, or, Dungog in New South Wales to try and find relatives of the, 3 people that died in the floods there in 2015, going to South Australia to try and, after Dick and Clayton Lang died on Kangaroo Island, a story that got national attention, going to the funeral, not knowing, my initial anxiety was sort of, as a journalist, was focused on, will anyone talk to me? These are intensely personal events and questions that I'm asking. This is a debate where, very often in the wake of these natural disasters, it's seen as somehow opportunistic or politicising to raise the question of climate change, and journalists avoid it. I think that's actually, by the way, that's changing. But then what I found when actually people started telling me their stories was not only that they were willing to talk, but that not everyone. I mean, I got plenty of people saying that they didn't want to talk to me. But I also found that their stories were not only had an emotional impact, as you would expect, but that they were inspiring in the way that communities, families rally around, help each other in times of crisis. And so one thing I absolutely didn't expect was to find that the process of writing this book inspired me, filled me with hope, actually, that, when the chips are down, people do look after each other, and that they will rally together. And Australians, are very resilient and community-minded people. And I think we've seen that in the response to the pandemic. We see, that Australians do rally together and look after each other, and are capable of rising to a challenge. So I found it inspiring in a way that I didn't expect at all.
Was there a particular story that you think resonated with you the most? There wasn't one. There were moments, there were images that I suppose I am left with that will stay with me forever. I could rattle off half a dozen of those. It's like 2 brothers, Mark and Gerard Alford, telling me about how their dad, stuck at the bottom of their 8-frame house at Latrobe, floated their mum on a mattress as the waters rose, and held on so long that, the muscle tore from his arm bone until he couldn't hold on any longer, and, she drowned in their home in a flash flood that they just cannot understand. They still can't understand. I mean, it's a tragic story, and, luckily their father survived by going upstairs and was rescued by helicopter after, a long, 8 hours through the night in freezing water. And, that's a story that stays with me. I mean, there are other stories, from Black Saturday or from the Queensland floods that are already well known, that readers will recognise, that have an impact, talking to someone like, John Tyson about, how he lost his wife and son in the Toowoomba flood. Donna and Jordan Rice, tragic story. Talking to Dale Ahern about how he lost his both parents at Steele's Creek in Black Saturday. Talking to Elsa Vung and her 2 kids about how her partner Sam Lau died of Melbourne's thunderstorm asthma outbreak in 2016 in their lounge room. And he was only a mild asthmatic, and that event was a shock to the world. 10 people dying in one outbreak hadn't happened before anywhere. Talking to Peter Jackson about the death of his wife Leonie from melioidosis, tropical soil disease brought up after the Townsville floods. I mean, all of these stories are incredibly powerful, sad stories. And yet in each case what I've tried to do is talk to scientists and public health experts about how and why warming might be making
events like that more likely or more severe. And in some cases, there really is now a proven connection to global warming that might have taken years for the science to come in. Yeah, I've got about 15 different stories in there, which I hope will kind of represent the range of risks that we're facing as a result of, runaway climate change.
And you had been working on the book for some time before the unprecedented bushfires of the past summer, 2019 and 2020. How did that period of such unseen destruction shape your book?
Well, it's interesting, because I first had the idea and put it to a publisher in early 2017, but I had another book on the go, the book about the Greens, which then I got lost in and ended up running quite late because I did a hell of a lot of research on it. I only started finally work on this body count book, in sort of middle 19. Very quickly, it became obvious that we were heading into a fire season like we hadn't seen before, and both in terms of how early it was starting and the kind of places that were burning. And some of the very earliest interviews I did, people were saying this summer is going to be terrible. Sure enough, as I was writing it, that's exactly what happened. And, that again became a global story of how Australia was, I hesitate to use a cliche, canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world on climate change. But, when we were sending up a smoke plume that was circling the planet, and, you had images of people being evacuated by the military from, the Victorian coast of Malakuta there, that was a global story. And then followed up by the pandemic, which, as I started to research, and you would have seen, a series of articles have started to come out too about the connections between warming and what health experts call a new age of pandemics. In that a lot of the drivers of warming are the same drivers that are bringing humans and animals together. That's overpopulation, that's overdevelopment, deforestation, urbanisation. These mega trends have been identified for a long time, including by an Australian pioneer, Tony McMichael, whose contribution I think has been under-recognised, but is up there with, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring in the 60s, as a real pioneer of the connections between climate change and human health, the risks, from warming to human health. The Black Summer and then the pandemic have inevitably kind of fed into and fueled the book in a way that, of course, I could not have anticipated when I began it.
And from your perspective, do you think that the way that Australia and I guess the world is dealing with the current pandemic, do you think that's sort of a foreshadowing for how we might deal with a catastrophic climate disaster?
Well, there are many, there are some obvious kind of lessons, which I do in an epilogue try to draw out. We've just shown in our response to the pandemic, including from, a Conservative coalition government, that the lessons are, listen to the experts for a start. The populist responses of, Boris Johnson or Donald Trump are not the way to go, and science-led response is is the only way to beat the virus. And there's an obvious argument that could be made there that we should do the same thing with climate change. There's also an argument, I think, that, and I try to make this in the book, Australia has a very good track record on dealing with public health. In fact, our response to AIDS was world leading. Our response on plain packaging for cigarettes, as part of a tobacco control strategy, has been world leading. We were good. We were, early on seatbelts, early on drink driving laws. We have a proud history of putting the public health first. We have a world-leading public health system in Medicare. But what we haven't done is educate the public, raise awareness about the health risks of climate change. And yet they are very real and have been identified for a long time. And while they've taken, the issue has taken a bit of a back seat during the pandemic, I think that it's going to come, an awareness of this is going to come back with a vengeance when the virus is back under control. I think we saw evidence of that after the first wave of the infections, when it looked like Australia really had kind of got COVID-19 beat. Now it doesn't feel like it, as we speak at the end of July with, Victorian infection numbers continuing to climb. But we are heading into another bushfire season. We are about to receive recommendations at the end of August from the Bushfires Royal Commission. I think there will be, again, a focus on tackling this problem, and I think we will have learned a lot from the response to the pandemic about how we can make changes quickly, that the role of the government has an enormous role to play. It's not a question of leaving it to the market, and that the best approach is to listen to the science and the experts. So I'm hopeful that although I haven't dedicated to the book in any way to trying to provide answers, I'm just saying these are the risks that we're facing, and this is the toll that climate change is already taking. I'm hopeful that we will learn something out of this pandemic, and I hope that the book makes a contribution to raising the awareness about the health risks of climate change.
Well, on that note of hope, the book does touch on the silver lining of recent climate disasters, such as the fact that more people are believing in it and talking about it, and that these events have, as you said, brought communities and people together. How do you think that we can stay hopeful as the climate crisis inevitably gets worse over the years?
That's tough, because it is going to get worse. And the news is worse almost every single day. And even if Australia, does finally get cracking on, reducing our emissions, there still is a lot of warming that's locked into the system, which is yet to come. It's going to take decades, if not centuries, to get the warming problem under control. And so one of the lessons that a lot of the experts that I speak to, one of the lessons that they want to draw from these disasters that we keep having on a, seemingly getting worse and more frequent, the lesson that they want to draw is that we can do a lot to reduce our risk, our risk to human life and property, by building, stopping, for example, stop building on floodplains, stop building in fire-prone areas, stop building hot boxes that are going to not cope with heat waves. There are early warning systems that can be improved, and there are, so for example, the thunderstorm asthma outbreak in Melbourne, there was no public warning of that. There were scientists at the time saying, with the amount of weather we've had, the amount of wet weather we've had, the amount of pollen, there was a risk there that was identifiable. And so we can do a lot to make our community more resilient, but the first thing we have to do is identify the risk. And at this stage, I think deliberately, because governments have not wanted to face up to the risks, I think the public remains unaware, and confused about whether or not, these risks are real. People don't even agree yet that climate change is happening and is man-made. We haven't even got to first base. And the role of the government, not just in raising awareness, but then in mitigating the risk, is we're just so far behind. And I think state governments are starting to act and recognise that and realise that the inability of federal politicians to come together on this issue is kind of been stuck there for a decade at least, and there's no sign of it changing. So, they're beginning to act off their own bat, and all states now have a zero emissions by 2050 goal and so forth. But look, I specifically didn't get into what are the answers? You know, all I did was wanted to talk to people and tell the story in their own words of what happened to them, you know, and how they think and feel about it.
Well, Paddy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Max. It's a pleasure.